Hello, Magda. We have this funny thing. I can address you like this, but if I want to see you, I have to do this. Okay, thank you very much for your attention. We just found ourselves in the middle of the discussion already, so we almost can't hold ourselves back. I would like to welcome you to this last panel of the symposium. And we have three guests for this particular bit summarizing, or our idea of this panel was a bit of to give a bit of a summarize and a kind of punchy perspective into the future. So let's see how far we can get. It's called Theatres Hybrid Futures. And to my left, we have Ulf Otto. We have Christian Rakow to the right hand, or I think for the online people, it's the other way around. And we have Magda Romanska, who is joining us online. Let me just quickly introduce you to our guests. Christian Rakow is born in Rostock in '76. He's a theater critic and one of the editors of the theater online journal Nachtkritik.de. He studied German linguistics and literature as well as philosophy in Rostock, Berlin, and Sheffield, and earned his PhD in literary studies at Münster with a PhD entitled The Economies of Realism, Cultural Poetic Studies in Literature and Economics between 1850 and 19. He was a member of the jury of the renowned Berlin Theatertreffen between 2017 and 19, and he has been co-organizer of the conference. And meanwhile, how many editions did you have of Theater and Netz?
It's going to be the 10th edition.
The 10th edition, Theater and Net. So since 2013, you've been concerned with questions that we are dealing with in this panel and in the symposium in general. He was one of the editors of the volume Netz Theater, Positions, Practice, Productions that came out last year. No, 2 years, sorry. We have Ulf Otto. Here, Ulf is a professor of theater studies and intermediality in Munich. His research focuses on interdependencies of theatricality and technology in industrial as well as post-industrial cultures, and is informed by science and technology studies. You also worked on topics such as reenactments, algorithms, interventions. You've published in at Transkript, Metzler, Alexander Verlag, Theater der Zeit, etc., etc. And the current project that Ulf is interested in deals with theoretical methodological elaboration of approaches of actor network theory and the testing of methods of computational humanities. So welcome. And we have Magda Romanska, who is a principal at Harvard metaLab, and has contributed to the manifesto that is exhibited in parts downstairs in the Rotunda. And Magda is an associate professor of theater at Emerson College in Boston. She holds an MA, is a research associate at the Center of European Studies and Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard University, and the chair of Transmedia Arts Seminar at Harvard University Mahindra Humanities Center, where she curates a series of lectures on transmediality. And her research, and this is the biggest research, or I just mentioned transmediality, your main research focuses on the intersection of theater and transmedia, including multi-platform dramaturgy, human IA interaction in performance, and post-human theater and performance. She's also founder, executive director, and editor-in-chief of the theatretimes.com, the largest global digital theater portal. So welcome, Magda, Ulf, and Christian. I would like to ask Magda, maybe you want to start making a presentation, and we go one after the other before we go into the discussion. So we have 3 short impulses of about 10 minutes before we start the discussion. Okay.
Thank you so much, Nina, for this introduction. And I'm really happy to be here. And thank you for organizing this wonderful conference that I hope will help us contextualize and theorize those new forms of theater. And Nina asked me to speak a little bit about what we do at metaLab, and also maybe offer a little bit of a summary of the lecture which I gave at the start of the pandemic, which is trying to systematize thinking about transmedia and hybrid digital theater, depending how you call it, and perhaps expand a little bit on some of the concepts. So I did prepare a little summary, and I'm going to go over it quickly, and then hopefully maybe engage new questions as well. So at the Transmedia Arts Seminar, which is co-sponsored by Humanities Center and metaLab at Harvard, it has been kind of operating for the last 3 years. And since the pandemic started, of course, we went online, and we've been trying to have one lecture per month for the last 2 years to document the different developments in digital performance and different aspects of transmedia and transmediality. And last year at metaLab, we also started a research group, what we call Future State Research Group. And part of that was the manifesto, which was a sort of our attempt to try to provide a framework for the changes and hopefully encourage rethinking of some of the paradigms, including touring and the typical staging that are both like becoming unsustainable, both environmentally and financially for many theater companies and institutions. So trying to offer a potentially alternative model or rethink some of the fundamentals of funding, touring, staging, and audience outreach. So I welcome everybody to come visit and sign up for our seminars as well. Today I want to just give us a very short overview of. Hold on, I have to move my screens a little bit. So we have this movement that we are seeing right now is basically, hold on, I'm kind of okay, I'm sorry guys, my screens are weirdly arranged. So we're moving from Aristotelian dramaturgy to epic and post-dramatic dramaturgy. And obviously in Aristotelian dramaturgy, we have the unity of time, space, and action, which allows for a dissonance between all three in the Brechtian and post-dramatic dramaturgy, where things still happen on stage, but they can happen in different within a different. Sorry, I don't know what's going on here. I'm so sorry about this. Which happen in the same, it's still in the same building, we're still in theater, in the same space and in the same time. However, in the transmedia dramaturgy, we have a kind of a meta structure where things are out of sync. Both time, space, and action is disjointed and can happen along the continuum of time and space in different spaces at different times. So we can manipulate both the story, the content of the drama, but also the form for the audience members, for the participants. So obviously this kind of dramaturgy challenges the spectatorial co-presence, liveness, and the notion of reception. And it comes with a couple of challenges. So we're moving from a plot and character-driven kind of a realistic through the post-dramatic, which was more of a visually driven and space-driven, towards what we call narrative architecture or dramatic architectonics, when the space both a physical space, which can be immersive, and then virtual space, which also has a storytelling potential. So, the person comes into such a space and they learn about the background of the characters, not through the exposition, but through the interaction with the space. So the space becomes a very important element in that sort of storytelling, and it's has its all function, not just to illustrate the context, not just to illustrate the where things happen, but to also have a kind of a narrative function to tell us the past and perhaps to anticipate the future. So in the classical dramaturgy, we ask about characters' motivation, dramatic structure, climactic moment, and about catharsis. But in the transmedial dramaturgy, we ask about the agency of the audience, how much they can do, the level of connectivity between different components of the story. So different elements, how do they interact, and the audience point of access. So from where do the people come into their work? Are they coming in from a digital environment, a real life environment? Which are they going to access app first, VR set first? Is this going to be Twitter, or where are they going to come in? So those elements cannot be controlled as well as in the traditional theater. And this also means that the way that premise is communicated has to change. So, just a kind of a short summary. In the classical dramaturgy, we have exposition, character motivations, climactic moments, suffering, reversal, recognition, catharsis, and we have some form of linear story, linear representation of things. That even if the narrative itself is not non-linear, if we have flashbacks, we move back and forth, what we see on stage, it still, has a kind of a linear form, and that's not necessarily what can happen, what happens in a transmedial dramaturgy. We have a different components and different ways of thinking and conceptualizing what happens. So narrative architectonics, I already mentioned, what story does the space tells us, which variable will be fixed, is it time, space, or action, or which variable will be movable, and not just, I'm talking here for the characters, but for the audience. Then we have the agency of the audience, of course, choice and versus control. How much choice do they have to explore the environment, or how much choice do they have to pick and choose which components they want to see in which order? And then we have the free play, the exploration of the environment, and finally the level of connectivity between audience members and different storytelling modules. So is everything autonomous? So can all of the components exist independently of each other, or are all of the components connected and somehow you have to access all of them to have the full story, to have the full work when we're thinking about hybrid or transmedial performance? And I already mentioned the audience point of access, where is the beginning and where is the end? And we have multiple beginnings and multiple ends, which of course makes it for potentially multiple interpretations of a particular experience. And that's what people who are traditionally trained in theater or film have the biggest problem, because the kind of training that you get is the first image, and then the last image is the most important one, and whatever happens in the middle is the transition from the first image to the next image, to the last image. And so what if those are different, and there are multiple combinations of those beginning and endings? Finally, the character in Aristotelian dramaturgy is proper, believable, consistent, like we see in realism. In post-dramatic theater, in theater of the absurd, we have the character, which is figuration, symbol, metaphor, object, prop, is abstract and oftentimes broken into multiple characters, for example. But in transmedia, we have an additional component where the character is you and you are the character. So in also the different participatory, experiential, immersive, interactive experiences and location-based hybrid reality performance games, the audience member becomes an additional character, which you kind of have to account for when you're building the experience. And then, of course, we have also the different techno objects, which cannot necessarily always be controlled. The algorithmic theater, robot and AI theater, data theater, post-human characters, and space as character. So as I think folks mentioned yesterday, that there is this, a factor of unpredictability with data, with once you involve a certain processing capacities, you don't necessarily always know where you're going to end up. So, so there is a lot of contingency and unpredictability that is potentially built into this kind of work. So the movement, the other way to conceptualize it is we're moving from typically character building, which people doing things usually to other people, to the world building when you are doing things, people are doing things, objects, algorithms are doing things, and you don't always know who is doing what, how, and to whom. And so the challenges in the world building, of course, is that the kind of a vertical and horizontal integration of the world rules. So everything kind of has to have a similar system of value across different platforms that you're using for the work. The rules have to be similar, even though the environment might change. And you have to have morally justified symbolic structure, or if it's not, it has to be premeditated. The decision has to be premeditated. And of course, you have to have a question, so what, why we even doing it? So the actual integration of technology is for the purposes of saying something about, existence within this new world, rather than just kind of a gimmicky application. So this is what I kind of always like to show my students, the three different representations of the war. This is, realist theater. The 3rd of May, we have a 3-act structure where, here we know what happened before, there were houses over here. So most likely he's wearing pajamas. So there was knock on the door. They came in, they grabbed him, they took him out, and they're gonna shoot him. And we see that, the painting is the climactic moment here. And we know what's gonna happen in the 3rd act. The wife, the mother is going to find the bodies, and there will be a scene of suffering at the end. So this is a kind of a 3-act structure of this painting. It's very visible, and of course the focus here is on the character. Here we have Picasso's Guernica, which it's a little bit different. The character is dispersed. We don't know where to look. The suffering is distributed sort of around the painting, and we are not asked to focus on any particular individual. We are kind of made feel a certain feelings through the image as a whole. The way that the space is filled from end to end, and there is not one particular focus. This is, how typically the post-dramatic theater would work, But our attention is dispersed. There is not a single person to focus on. There is not a single driven character. There is not a 3-act structure, because this can take place, in 2 minutes or in 10 years. It doesn't tell us what happened before or after. Like, it's kind of a continuum of time. And so this is how we can think about post-dramatic theater if you want to kind of show it visually, the structure of it. And here it's it's our newsfeed. It's kind of a transmedia way of thinking about war. That just comes at us from different dimensions, from different sources, unfiltered, and told through multiple points of view and through multiple images, and we have to kind of make sense out of it by looking at it, and we are participants in meaning making and in deciding how we wanna process that. And so this kind of a next step into transmedia representation of human experience, human suffering, is quite complex, because we know that those images come at us on our news feeds. In the one picture you can see a burning child, in the other picture you can see, I don't know, Paris Hilton eating ice cream. And so there is this disconnect, this flattening of suffering that is happening on our screens. And so how do artists tackle that flattening and use those technologies in order to generate an intellectual and emotional engagement with with the issues of human misery. Just to give you kind of different people use different technologies, and we are trying to we are in this process of trying to figure out how to categorize them. So this is just to give you a small little example of how to even think about Zoom theater. Yeah, Zoom theater seems like, oh, it's a simple thing, but actually when you think about it, there are like 7 different types of Zoom theater. It's multi-site but not site specific, without site fixed audience, is synced but open-ended. You can watch it later if you want to. The character is grounded in face and body, so and in face and voice, so it's a kind of a bodiless, immobile acting. And we have, as I mentioned, 7 types of Zoom styles. There is the realistic, not Zoom specific. It can happen outside of Zoom. Yeah, we have Zoom specific for things that happen only on Zoom, and written for Zoom. And then we have integrated with other platforms like with Twitter or Facebook. And we have adaptations of pre-existing text on Zoom. And then we have meta Zoom plays, which grapple with the limit of form and attempt to use form to comment on the text and on the content of the presented material. And then we have a kind of a post-dramatic Zoomturgy with more abstract ways of representing things, which is kind of on the border between experimental film and live and post-dramatic theater in some way. So even if we just think about simple Zoom theater, we already can kind of try to systematize it and create vocabulary of what we are seeing and how to think about it and what happens in those different ways of representing. The audience relationship to the work will be different. The acting will be different. The staging will be different, depending on on which approach you take. So why do we need new transmedia dramaturgy? It can help us shape the framework and vocabulary for human machine in 3D transmedial and digital narrative. So, the big question, what do you want to say, do, and why, versus what are you actually doing, saying, and why? And how is what you're saying and watching contributing to the transmedia narrative you are participating in? And a transmedia dramaturgy can help us also uncover how knowledge and emotions are created and shaped between the virtual and real spaces. So, from conspiracy theories and political campaigns to multiplayer immersive video games and multi-platform narratives. If in theater we have an incredibly powerful potential to be able to kind of understand how meaning is created in those spaces and kind of between the virtual and the real world. And we can experiment and we can analyze and we can provide perhaps certain answers to help us shape the reality and to help us understand how information contributes to the way that we function in the world right now. What's new things? So Nina asked me, what are the new things today? So hold on, I have to get this. So the new things is first we worry about temporal syncing of the premise. Yeah, and I'm using premise here with a kind of Aristotelian meaning of it. What's the message of the work that you actually do? So in transmedial theater, the syncing of the premise happens in temporal space versus durational syncing, which we see in the classical theater. And that's much more difficult to do, yeah, because people will access this work at different times in different spaces, and you don't always hold their attention at the same time, and you cannot necessarily sync things and have control over that. So temporal syncing of the premise is very important, but it's very difficult to do. Things have to be repeated, circular, redelivered through multiple channels. You also, make space for audience to discuss the experience, so either during or after the experience. Digital pre, during, post-show talkbacks are going to be important in order to create community, and in some ways also to replace, their intermission chats, and building a community around the ideas, not necessarily around the particular works, but around the ideas that the works are entertaining. The second big issue is that, scripts written for these different mediums, which take under consideration the physical limits and possibilities of new technologies versus adaptation and streaming of old texts written for stage specifically. And Sarah mentioned that they work with Shakespeare, and they work with Shakespeare in a quite innovative way, where it's not a kind of a standard adaptation, but it tries to make comment on the technology and modernity in a way of using Shakespearean story more so than focusing on Shakespearean story. Like putting Hamlet in VR, it's not going to be particularly interesting because we can just watch it in theater. But doing something like a Hamlet machine, like Annie Dorsen did with algorithms, it's more interesting because it tells us something about the nature of text and the nature of the machine. New ways of script formatting to take under account the different components can happen in different digital and real spaces. So we don't even have, standardized script formats. Like, how do you format things on Zoom and not on Zoom? Like, you have to kind of describe it, and it's very awkward, yeah? So we have to, one of the big projects of dramaturgical projects will be developing new standards for script formatting for different mediums. Finally, creating the experience with balanced time and effort investment. So going to theater versus logging in. And people mentioned that theater is not, you not just go to theater to like watch a show, you go because it's a whole experience. You spend time with someone, you look at other people, among the people, you get dressed nicely. Yeah, I mean, historically, the theater was a sphere for like doing business for the upper classes. So you want to be shown in theater with whom and by whom and all of those things. So there is a social component still to going to theater, and the digital sphere or hybrid projects are still sort of grappling with how to actually replace that social component. So redefined purpose. If cathartic release is not the objective, what is? What form would catharsis take in the hybrid transmedia environment? So if there's kind of a linear presentation in a highly controlled spaces, like traditional theater can no longer happen, and a lot of immersive theater have already experimented with that. What is the other objective if the cathartic release might not necessarily be the end or the way we try to accomplish it in film or in theater. And finally, diversification of the message. So re-engagement with ideas versus ideological affirmation. And we already mentioned that theater is predominantly in most countries, it's urban activity, typically for educated class. So it's very much a kind of a conversation with those particular audiences and the reaffirming of their what they already know to be true. And if you're trying to go beyond that, reach audiences which are not from that environment, whether economically, educational wise, or not, from not your country or your environment, there has to kind of be a rethinking of those fundamentals of what the typical class going theater going class believes in, and kind of engage in a discourse that is both local and global, kind of a local philosophy that we have to, try to imbue these works with. And finally, the big new thing is the meta transmedia, which I find the most interesting, which means commenting on the limits and possibilities of the new forms and technologies. So commenting and analyzing the impact of new forms and new technologies on human relations, meaning building and structural changes of our psychics. So what I mean by this is that, the best works of theater or the best works of art, which have always experimented with the new form, somehow managed to unify the form and content. So we see this in Brecht, in Beckett, in Heinemüller, where what we see on stage is also in some ways extension of the new way of presenting, of a new form that the work is trying to interrogate. So, so works which in some way acknowledge that this is a new space, this is a new environment, and this is new ways of conceptualizing ourselves would be probably, the most successful in pushing the form and in creating pieces which are kind of most memorable. So I wanted to play for you 1 minute of a kind of a show that was fairly successful in the US in 2020. And the reason why I think it was successful was because in some way it commented on the fact that it was a piece of hybrid transmedial theater. And it was adaptation of Chekhov's Cherry Orchard. Some components were pre-recorded and played during the performance, but there was also a live component with audience participation. So you could not just watch it, you actually had to actively participate and respond to questions as they were being asked of you during the show. And you can see other members of the audience as well. This was a production done by a Zero Gravity lab here in Boston. I really liked it because it sort of, there was a kind of a nice parallel between the form and the content. That Cherry Orchard is about alienation and being alone together with other people and kind of living in this secluded, alienated existence. And we all kind of stuck in the pandemic with our own bubble. And so this, trying to figure out what reality is in the same way that Chekhovian characters have been trying to figure out what the reality is, yeah? And so this work, by adapting Chekhov in that way, it was in a kind of a philosophical dialogue with Chekhov while trying to understand our contemporary human condition and the changes in our psychic, or maybe not really changes that a new technology and then the pandemic, has been making. And so let me just play it for you quickly. Okay, now it's gonna and I don't know why it's going on. Yeah, of course.
Magda, can you hear me? There's no sound.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I have to stop sharing. Can you guys do you have time? I can stop sharing and then just reshare it again.
We give it one more try. Otherwise, is there anyone in the space who hasn't seen it? Because we had this example already earlier. Yeah.
If you guys see it, I don't have to play it. So yeah, probably a lot of people have already seen, seen the show, and you can watch it as well.
Let's maybe try it once more. Then.
He's a busy man. He pays no attention.
I think I'm like right now I'm like little frozen there.
To me.
The present is disgusting.
So I don't know why the sound
but
is
when
you guys can go and check it out and Google Chekhov OS, and you should be able to find the clip and the whole show as well.
Oh, so good.
And I invite you all to join and follow our transmedia art seminars at Mahindra, as a couple of interesting lectures that are trying to figure out different relationship between theater and video game, and theater and metaverse, and theater and larger kind of transmedial issues of conspiracy theories and other alternative reality games and things like that. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Magda. I'm sorry, but most about the video, but most of us have seen it already in a different context, which will be very interesting for you, Seda. Maybe you want to say a few words, because I think there are really overlaps between, not now, later, between those different contexts. So thank you very much, Magda, for putting these new developments in the theater in the context of, or looking at them through the perspective of narrative and storytelling. I would like to hand over to Christian now, and please ask you to give a little impulse. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the invitation, Nina, to this inspiring conference. As a theater critic, I speak from the perspective of an audience member, so I'm not a producer. My first slide is a simple answer to the question, what is the hybrid? I have a slightly different notion of it, I think. For me, there is a theater that is initially intended for an offline audience, and a lot of that has been streamed for the last 2 years. And then you have theater that is intended for an online audience. And I think we've seen the producers of Interrobang, and we have seen the producers of Werther Live. Those were productions which were like proper online theater. And if we speak about hybrid theater, obviously we have to think of a form of theater that can address both audiences at the same time. And I think that is quite a difficult task to fulfill. And to start with, I want to share, that's the next slide, a quote with you by Judith Ackermann. She's a professor of media communication here in Potsdam. And she says, the idea of the digital is that I always do different things at the same time, and not only receive, but also interact. But for theater, it is still new to be a secondary medium, or a medium amongst others. In German, she says, an nebenbei medium. That was the starting point of her reflection of, okay, where are we heading if we want to present theater online? And also we have maybe later time to reflect, okay, what are these other media doing? How is, for instance, Machina X compared with proper adventure games, maybe? You know, what's a special thing if a theater group does that compared with game designers, maybe? Now, the reception conditions online, as Judith Ackermann says, that would be the next slide, are quite different from the offline reception conditions. And in theater, we tend to speak about the suspension of disbelief. I'd like us to speak about the suspension of disconnection. Yeah, we have a kind of disciplinary framework in the theater. It is quite hard to leave. If you find it boring, it costs you a lot to leave the room. And that allows for very different art forms, which kind of rely on our attention, maybe, taken for granted. It's like a lot of post-traumatic theater that has come up, and a lot of new writing kind of experimented with the suspense, the question of how do we arouse interest. Yeah, if you think about this new writing in the style of Elfriede Jelinek, which is like texture rather than structure, you can do that if you have a disciplinary frame where people are willing to contemplate on the event. Now, I think you get the idea that online that is quite a different question, I'd say. So we lack this disciplinary framework. Yeah, if it's boring, I just switch the channel. And yeah, in offline theater, the community is taken for granted. Yeah, we're all there. It's a kind of given community. Online, the presence of the community is always there, is only there by communication. Yeah, you only see people are there if they communicate. Whereas in a sort of regular theater, in an offline theater, of course, we need to be quiet. Or maybe in a comedia, we should be laughing, but it's not like we should communicate. Oh, well done! Great stuff, Macbeth! Come on, kill her! That's not the way. And yes, Magda has already said a lot about the dimension of the spatial logic online. Yeah, we speak about different windows. So online we have a spatial logic, whereas offline we have linear reception, basically linear events. And yes, a lot has been said about the interaction instead of the reception. Agency was the word that Tina and Björn used earlier on. We have shorter attention spans. And whereas in offline theater, we speak a lot about the feedback loop. But I mean, feedback is really, really decent in regular theater, normally. Yeah, it's a bit like laughing, a bit maybe clapping if, the singer was nice. But it's not like really agency, yeah, like for me, taking part, communicating with the people up there. So all in all, a totally different audience condition online. And also the thing online, you need to have, you want to have further processing of content. You want to become creative, I think, yeah? If you see a Facebook post, you want to share, you want to retweet, you want to maybe even comment, maybe want to create a meme in order to sort of respond. Yeah, this is all kind of creative stuff that you do in order to react to the given event. Now, and I promised to bring one example I find particularly inspiring if we speak about the hybrid theater. That would be the next slide. It was actually created before the pandemic in 2015 by Force Entertainment, this group from Sheffield. What they did was complete works, tabletop Shakespeare. They took 1 hour and they narrated a Shakespeare play just by using kitchen items like the glass, yeah? And the thing would be Macbeth and the stage, and 3 witches come up. One of them says, "Hail Macbeth, Thane of Cawdor." Yeah, something like that. That's the way it starts. And now what they did was they also streamed their performance, their offline performance online. And I think this is where they really addressed 2 different types of audiences. And that would be the next slide. I watched the thing offline, and it was really kind of meditation, really focusing on the narrative, really quiet, very calm atmosphere, just 40, 50 people in the room. And online, it was a bit like a circus. people chatting, people, tweeting on Twitter. And I think this production did quite a few things well, in my respect. One of them, of course, is it used English language. It used Shakespeare, sort of very familiar, very well-known stuff. And that helped them to bring together audiences from different places all over the world, from England, from Poland, from many, many places where Force Entertainment produced their stuff and where they have kind of fan groups. Yeah, so they kind of brought together these fan groups. And yes, of course, they made it a live experience. Otherwise, you couldn't have this interaction. You couldn't have this reaction of the people. And it was storytelling, as I said, with using quotes, little quotes by Shakespeare, and the rest is kind of abbreviated. Now coming to the point, it is minimalistic. And I think throughout the last 2 years, I think we have seen that minimalist theater is quite successful online. And here you have just, it's not about character, it's not about sort of acting, it is about just, what do you say, you just attribute the role, yeah? You just say, this is Macbeth, and this is all it takes. And it is a very sort of old-fashioned theatrical way of creating things. It is, Peter Brook has been mentioned earlier, you have the empty stage and you just refer to an absent world. So the world is not present, you just refer to it. So that was quite successful. And because it was all about narrative, it also worked well just on the audio track, a bit like audiobooks or so. You could, cook your meal and still listen to the play. Because it was so reduced, you don't actually lacked the visual information if you just followed it on the audio track. Very good idea. So you could switch channels. You could be on Twitter and still follow the thing, multitasking. And yes, they embedded quite well in other media. They started with a tautological essay on Nachtkritik. They also kind of nicely introduced this hashtag complete works, so people could join just using this hashtag. And thus, they created a community like a global village of art lovers, of performance art lovers. I think that's what they did. And the next slide shows us just a tiny impression of what was going on. Yeah, you had people, and that was 2015. It was redone in 2021, but that was 2015, way before the pandemic. And just one up left is really inspired by the fantastic complete works by Force Entertainment. We did Chekhov's Three Sisters. Yeah, this is what people do. They start making their own little artistic comment on what they saw on stage. And yes, you see people sitting in Warsaw watching the play. And also someone comments on if this is a good train for Lear, with these cups that are easily broken. So this is the kind of communication I think you get online, and this is why I call it a circus. Where people sort of, it was really lively. And it was hybrid. Yes, it worked for the offline audience as well as for the online audience. I might bring up a few examples later on in the discussion. Last thing, that would be the next slide. Yes, a few things I kind of noticed while watching a lot of online productions. I mean, we stream a lot on Nachtkritik as well. It really feels theatrical if it kind of comes from this notion of the rough theater or the empty stage, this Peter Brook idea, yeah, where only sort of you see an actor and he or she create a world just by using gestures, basically. The more it is reduced, the more successful it felt. And yes, you focus on probably quite old-fashioned, really. You focus on the creation of characters and world rather than on performativity. I think dance theater is really problematic online. And yes, what was really touching was you had a very, you had a kind of renaissance of the chamber theater, like the intimacy, also of dialogue, probably because that was the situation when we are in front of a computer, in front of the desktop. Obviously, we are single. Most of the time, we are single people in front of a computer. So yeah, those things that kind of use it as a kind of chamber theater situation, they were quite successful. And thirdly, I think all great productions, starting with Werther Live, and we mentioned Show Me a Good Time by Gob Squad last night, they all kind of reintroduced concepts of suspense. Yeah, and suspense is not only, okay, you need a conflict and, you know, there needs to be a murder and you have proper drama, but it can also be challenge. Like Gob Squad was a lot about, can they actually make it, you know, at the spot of the hour to create their little performance? Can they find the title and so on? This is a quest. It was basically about quest and mission. And yes, this is, of course, a way of triggering the audience's attention. And I think that was reintroduced. The successful groups, they all reintroduced concepts of suspense and challenge and employment. And this is what I'd like to also answer to Chris's question of, okay, what content is successful? I think this is the content.
Very interesting. With lots of narrative stuff today. Looking forward to discuss this. Thank you so much, Christian, for this impulse. Very, very interesting and inspiring. So I hand it over to Ulf now for the last presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for still being here, and thank all the people in the background to making this work. This is really amazing. I'm a bit shy about my contribution because I haven't seen much during the pandemic. Everything was online, but I didn't have much time. And of what I have seen, I haven't liked much. And what I liked, I didn't like because it was some new kind of digital theater, some viral theater or distributed performance. I just liked it because it was somehow good art. I think the tabletop Shakespeare is a good point. Hamilton on Disney Plus is also a good point for me, or Swoosh-Lieu, the work A Room of One's Own, which is basically a performative movie, is also one of my favorites. So what I'm interested in is not digital theater. And I have the suspicion that discussions about digital theater as a new form of genre tend to go into formalist discourse, which I'm skeptical about. But what I'm interested in is theater in digital cultures. And I think that is really, really important. And I think Christian just had one point. The emergence of social media is very decisive for that. And I just want to stress that the reception of theater, all kinds of theater through social media, is really one of the big game changers. And we have all these formerly marginalized groups which can articulate them now through social media. And now we have discussions about abuse of power, about structural racism in theater that haven't been there for a long, long time in the German theater, and that have always been gone over, and they could sustain for years in the state institution. So I think if we talk about digitality and theater, that is something we should not forget to mention. So coming from this perspective, I was thinking about the topic of our panel, and I have noticed that I have a problem with all of the three terms: future, hybrid, and theater. And I would really like to discuss all of those three with you. My problem with future is that I have the feeling that due to climate catastrophe and due to digital media, our time horizon is not anymore the one of the 20th century, where we have some utopic future, but we have some enduring present, which we have to address, which we have to deal with. And that means also trying to solve problem right now, right here, to make things better. The second term, hybridity, that came up, I also would like to discuss, because in a way, doesn't hybridity insinuate that there's two pure forms that then go together, some digital and some what is called often analog, which I find also an interesting term, because analog is really electronic media. But this idea of having some life that is real and then some digitality, I don't know whether that's still matches our reality that is completely digital. There is no outside of the digital. So that is the second term I would love to talk about. And this third one is theater, because I don't know whether our contemporary art practice and many of the interesting good works can still be really comprehended very well as theater as this specific medium. I mean, Dick Higgins in 1966 had this idea of intermedia arts, which was not that art should be intermedia, but that what is there as art is intermedia in a way. And I think within our digital or post-digital realities, especially in the fine art scenes, we have that a lot, that this idea of these different genres of art does not help so much to discuss what is interesting about contemporary art. So I would question, or would love to discuss, whether we should still put our works, contemporary works in performance and theater into that tradition. But this was just the opener, but I try to make it short. I have a paper, I'm not going to read it because it's too late for an academic paper, but what I have brought is 3 tentative observations. And I still have time to give them. I'll try to make them short. The first one is from a scientific academic perspective. During the lockdown, it was like a breaching experiment. Though there was no theater in the first lockdown, there was lots of discourse. There was more and more articles about why theater is relevant, why we need theater. And I have the impression it was very interesting because one could see what thoughts from the past and from the present are driving theaters. And I think that is an interesting point to start with. And I would like to just mention what I found interesting. One argument to prove theater's relevance was new audiences in digitality. The second one was innovation. We need new formats, like very much a startup discourse that was also there. And the third one was an old idea of theater as an ideal form of assembly, which goes back to 18th century theater thought in Germany, especially. Theater is the nucleus of democracy, and we find it in there. All these 3 things, I thought, tell more about the past of the theater than the future. And I would think one has to discuss what baggage we have from the past and whether it helps to understand what theater's position in digital cultures is. The second that connects to that is a strong imperative to produce, to have a production there. And could you show the webpage, the Niemand kommt? I was very impressed by this festival that was here also in Berlin. And I want to just mention who was responsible for it: Daniel Brunet, Susanne Völlmer, Elisa Müller, and Jenny Schröder. This idea was intriguing to me. Have a festival and nobody is there. Participate by not showing up, pay for not getting anything back. For once, it was possible to be part of theater while not attending. And accordingly, it was possible to pay artists for their work instead of their product. I found that very, very an utopian idea, to pay for the work and not the product. And for me, it was great because I wouldn't have to go, because I didn't have time to go, and I could still feel part of the theater. And I think that is something that I think is something post-pandemic to think about. How do we evaluate theater? All the funding, most of funding things, need the performance. If you don't have the final performance in the end, you can have great work, you could have great rehearsals. The last performance doesn't come, you have to pay back the funding. So especially in subsidized theater, I think this question of what is theater, might theater be something else than performance, is also an economically important thought to have. So I think post-pandemia, that would be my second. My second thesis is that we should think of theater as something more and else than performance, for many different reasons, because I think we saw what happened. I think many of the examples we saw today is that it is more than just the performance, and we can't just all reduce this into it. My third observation, my proposal, is that I have the feeling, but that is especially my academic perspective, that what might make a big change post-pandemic is the epistemological side. For the first time, we have massive data of theater, and we have completely new means to get to know theater. And not only as academics, but also the general public, we access theater through digitality, to digital media, not anymore through books, only secondarily. Before it was the feuilleton, the print culture, the library that ruled theater in a way. The power was there. That has gone. Now we know theater increasingly through this digital media. And that will have, I think, strong implications, because it will change the whole idea of what theater is, because these practices of knowing are there. One example that I find very interesting is that we see in the humanities, we have this for sometimes this whole thing of digital humanities that starts with how to read 1 million books. The philologists started computer linguistics, they had algorithms starting with deep learning, 1 million books, read them. And that was completely new perspective on literature. You had the breadth, you went beyond the canon, you could see different ideas of literature in the breadth. They started doing that a couple of years in fine art history because they had all these image libraries. In theater, it wasn't still possible. It was never possible to do real computational humanities because we didn't have the big data and we didn't believe in it. We believed in the eyewitness. It was always the privilege of the person with her or his body there, seeing it phenomenologically, experience it. That was the prime source. If you hadn't been there, you couldn't write about it. This is also, again, an economical thing. You cannot become an opera studies person without certain money because you can afford to see the performances in a way. So we have this kind of barrier. Now we have a different one. I think this will be a big change because it also has this idea of distance. We have the locality. Through that, we need in the future, I think, arguments to study only the Volksbühne here close by. Yeah, we need some reason. Now it's only because it's close by, and of course I'm going there. But in a certain digital geography where I could study South American performances in breadth at some point, I need some reasons why not to, from an academic point of view. So I think this is something that I would like to contribute, which is a different perspective than the producers. That I think the way we look at theater will change due to digital media, and that will have, I think, long-lasting effects on the theater arts, because also, like all digital media, there is some standardization. There's big initiatives working on data models that define what theater is. Ontologies are built not in theoretical discourse, like before Peggy Fallon, who said an ontology of performance is the disappearance, but no, now we have computer scientists who say performance consists of this relation and that relation and this and this and this data set. And I think that is a big changer for our contemporary thinking about theater. Yes, thank you, I stop.
Great, thank you very, very much. So we have 3 very comprehensive and very rich contributions. And I have looking back on what we have discussed in the past couple of days and taking into account what you just said, it feels like there are these 2 different main direction to talk about the relationship between theater and digitality. The one that is talking, that was mainly concerned that with the panel that we had before, that was very much concerned with how can we apply digital media to theater. And it feels like what you just discussed was the opposite, and how far is theater situated in digital media, or how does theater change in digital media, or is there such thing as theater in digital media? How does it relate? And this is also something that we discussed yesterday with regard to the how fear. Instead of asking how can we make digital theater, you ask what can artists, no matter where they come from, due to digitality, or how can they reflect on digitality? So there are these two different directions, and I wonder where, with the example that you showed us, and maybe putting these 2 different views, and Magda, I may put you in the box with Christian in terms of narrative. You emphasize very much the narrative quality of these works. Although
I think my understanding of narrative is kind of very flexible. Pretty much anything that aims to have a purpose can be construed as narrative. Yeah, it's just a question whether it's a realistic or post-dramatic narrative form. But anything that has some purpose to communicate some sort of philosophical thought can be construed as narrative, because you are trying to say something with whatever it's, if it's a linear traditional Aristotelian piece, or if it's Heine Miller, there is a narrative there as well. So so I just want to clarify that the notion of narrative in that context should be a little bit wider. And of course, this is juxtaposed with a game, theater games, and in which the theater borrows from video games. And historically, we've seen the trend of theater borrowing the video game framework, and what I call gamification of theater. But recently, we've seen a little bit reverse trend, and some of that philosophical foundation that theater has been moving back to the video games, and they become not necessarily game-based, but a little bit more introspective and engaging with philosophical questions. So, so that's sort of like a little bit in opposition to the narrative with the purpose, with the premise. And the third, component of that is the experience. Yeah, you do something just for the experience, that like, I don't know, live wedding or whatever. Yeah, there is certain component of ritual and performance and experiential kind of embodied or virtually embodied experience that doesn't necessarily have a kind of a premise itself. It's just something fun that you do. And so those three different types of things have different purpose. So what I'm interested in primarily is a theater with a purpose, or like is a event or a work of art with a purpose, of some kind of engagement with philosophical questions of the day, of the times. So.
I think we speak about two different things when we speak about theater. So the complex symbiotic system on the one side, and then maybe, which was debated by Ulf, if there's such a thing as an essence or so of theater. And I think it's well worth remembering of, okay, what is the theatrical aspect of our expression. When my little daughter asks me, okay, what is an elephant? In our kitchen, I tend to go like this. Yeah, I tend to kind of represent a thing that is absent. If I was a filmmaker, I'd probably go, to Africa and film an elephant. And if I was a good drawer, I would probably able to draw an elephant. And if I was a game designer, I would probably invent a game for her, where she could use an elephant and find food and all that kind of stuff. So I think, yes, there is such thing as a kind of theatrical kind of essence of a theatrical expression. And this is quite important if you reflect on, okay, what can a theater maker contribute to online media? And I think he or she can contribute the spontaneous element of creating images, abstract images, rather than specific or visual images or concrete images. And this has been quite new, because theater makers for a long time haven't done that all that much. They haven't been online. But I think we have seen quite a few productions where you could see, okay, it is good that a theater maker does this, and not a game designer or not a filmmaker. And I think it's worth speaking about, what can theater contribute?
Yes, I would say, I would answer to that. I don't think that the question of essence I don't think it makes so much sense to discuss it. And I'm, as a historical person, I would also put that away. I think that the two terms would be there. One's the institution of theater, and how does that transform? And then we have to differentiate There's a couple of institutions, but how do the institutions change? And the other thing, I think, is the artwork, in the art pieces of theater. And with those, really, I feel the main question is what do the single artworks do? What do they articulate? What do they show? What do they manage to? Why is the tabletop Shakespeare like amazing, or what's great about it? And I think that would be, I think that discussion doesn't, you cannot put it down to digitality or something, but you can discuss what does digitality to the media. Or take the example, VR, because we had that thing. One of the most amazing VR performances that I saw was Manic VR at the Ars Electronica, what the Golden Nika. It came out of the fine art context, and the idea was to use VR to realize the reality, the perceptual reality of a person with a psychotic disorder. So it was really modeling the rupture in perception that psychotic disorders have. And with that, I think also it kind of answered that question of what is particular about the medium of VR, that you can very greatly analyze subjective vision, subjective viewpoints that is done in fine art. But I think that is more what I think was interesting about VR, because it can do that, and not it can translate another media in there. So I think what I think great about is, like, if theaters do great art in the broadest sense with VR, what I find a little bit theoretical is the discussion of transferring theater into virtual space. I don't know if this spatial metaphor, which has always been used, if theater people discuss digital media, they use the spatial metaphor almost all of the time, having that in there. And I have doubts whether that is a good descriptive term for what this media actually is, and if we should not rather talk about the network effects of digital media.
Talking about the network, isn't that something that theater makers, taking your question, what can theater makers add to, let's say, reflecting about digitality by going online? What could be the function of doing this, or what could be a certain expertise that theater makers bring here? Is it what you said, just as you called it spontaneity or mimesis? Maybe, or is it, talking about network, is it assembly? One of the terms that you mentioned are very much highlighted in the discourse on digital theater. Is it assembly? Is it experts of an assembly that somehow reflect on social media, that have an artistic take on how social relations are shaped through digitality, etc.? Is there do you think there is a certain expertise that theater makers can bring? Or can somehow create here, maybe, or no, so not create, can bring into the discussion about digitality. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I would definitely say there is a certain kind of competence, there's a certain sensibility, there's certain expertise that theater people bring with them that can help us understand also digital media, and can articulate certain realities, and can use the spaces. I think it is excellent and amazing that theater people work in all kinds of possible ways with these media and discuss them, and don't exclude them because of some ideal of liveness or whatever, but embrace that and see what can be done with it. I just think what is articulated in the individual good works cannot be reduced to theater. The individual work is not good because it's kind of somehow translates theater, but because it's a good work. It's a great work that manages to make something visible about digital media. Like, I don't know, Dead Cat Bounce was managing to articulate in the space a certain network nature of our economic existence in the space. And I think the production was great because it really made that visible. And that had nothing to do with essence of theater, I would say, but just because with the individual setup of that work, in a way, to have one example that I was just thinking of.
We do have a comment here. I just read it out. Don't you think that theater artists, question, don't you think that theater artists are those that could make an audience online feel like getting back to IRL performances in cultural venues, thanks to some frustrating remote tools that are only temporarily satisfying? Digital industry has no economical interest to do it instead. Maybe there is here also a difference in the way theater artists involve themselves online. Thank you very much for this question and comment. Does anyone want to comment on that? In real life.
Okay.
Well, I mean, theater has to offer.
Magda, hang on, we are with you on an audio level in a minute. Theater has to offer something that film doesn't, that video games don't offer, and that social media don't offer. Yeah, I mean, like when we think about what's the origins of theater, it's in a kind of a philosophical, religious discourse of wondering what is our place in the universe and how do we, like why do we exist and what for, and all of those things that theater used to ask and philosophy used to ask. And other art forms do that very well as well, but then the new art forms such as video games and films, that's kind of and have an entertaining component, but don't necessarily always involve public in the same way that theater potentially has a potential to involve public. So if we can translate that notion of discourse that theater has traditionally managed to maintain into digital sphere, and somehow also be able to comment and analyze and respond and discuss and help us understand the metaverse of social media and HR and all of those things that are happening, and how meaning is being built in those spaces. And theater artists should help us figure it out and should help us manage and understand and find ourselves in those new digital reality. I mean, you mentioned that this is a big change. It's like Gutenberg invention of the press, yeah, the industrial revolution. I mean, last 20 years have completely changed the way that we communicate, the way that we conceptualize ourselves, the way that we define relationships. And theater kind of can be at the forefront of trying to understand that reality, that new reality. And that's what we can contribute, I think, in a unique way, because we have a history and tools of being able to do that in classical theater. So, I mean, if we think about the emergence of film, I mean, film initially emerged as a kind of an offshoot of theater. Yeah, I mean, the first film scripts were based on plays. The Hollywood movies of the 1940s, you first had a play and then it was staged. And even today, the playwright and film script writers move back and forth, and there is kind of a symbiosis and understanding that film structure was based on the dramatic structure. So this is a new art form that is also kind of emerging out of theater, but in addition to all of the other components that will require creating new vocabulary, both in terms of the formal vocabulary, but also in terms of how the content is being processed and developed. Are there any questions from the audience? Yeah, Ramona.
Thank you to all of you for the really exciting provocations. And I want to bring a question that I already had in the last panel and that sort of was hovering around there back to you guys, which is the hybrid future of theater one that is sort of a global theater rather than a local or situated theater? And is that, you know, necessarily, is that the real opportunity, a geographically dispersed theater, that's something that we can bring in? How would you look at that?
I'm sorry, I have to answer because it was just on my mind. I think, yes, it's nice going back to venues and everything. And in real life, I just learned it this minute. But Ulf spoke about the future and about the climate crisis and about, you know, the real problems at the moment. And I'm very confident that we can address these problems only if we have globally linked theater performances. Because what theater can do is it allows for the unexpected. So if you have a production like Show Me a Good Time of Gob Squad, and they linked Berlin and Sheffield and someplace in South England, and I can well imagine, link a place in Africa and in Asia, maybe India at the moment, and then some venue in the Western world, in Western Europe. And that'll be probably a very, very tough political statement. And if you design it in the right way, it will allow for the unexpected. And maybe the military will stand in and, you know, make problems for the performance, whatever. But that's the moment when you really get the feeling, okay, we are in a global village and we are really related to what's going on in India at the moment. So I think what we have achieved in the last 2 years is extremely important for addressing these problems in the future. And I'm still convinced that, yes, a theater maker does something different than a filmmaker or a game designer or a VR technician, because theater makers are experts in improvisation. They're experts in live interaction. And whatever you tell me, I might not be, you know, the right respondent, but a theater actress will respond in a very cool way and will make an impression. And I think it is worth speaking about why should theater makers do this? Because many, Ulf, you're right. I'm also saying, yeah, it's good to have nice works online. I don't care if it's art or digital art or game, or is it a theater? But you'll get these questions by theater makers because they say, okay, now that the lockdown is over, I go back to Deutsches Theater and do my stuff. Why should I bother with going online? I mean, that's the reality. So you really have to make a strong statement why it is well worth producing online. And I think Gob Squad and Force Entertainment, they have shown why it is well worth producing online, because you can create this idea of a global artwork.
Yeah, can I answer to that too? I would say no, in a way. And I would argue with an experience I had. I went, after being stuck in home office, I managed finally to get a ticket and to actually go to Volksbühne after I read Christian Rakow's review of the newest René Polish play. And I sat there, and it was like Bayreuth for me. It was like I was back. And I thought, I am back, and I had an extreme feeling of identity. I think that must be when other people go to Bayreuth, that they were saying, and I understood, and I thought it was right to drive out Chris Durkin. I was very ambivalent about that, but in that moment, I thought, okay, Polish is bringing this thing into the new Berlin. And there was a whole idea of like, what was interesting about that, this whole idea of Marvin Carlson, of the ghosting of in this theater being all that has been there. And there was, in a way, a kind of very local community at that point, a very local understanding that was at the same time changing, that was very specific. And I think theatrical languages are very, very culturally specific, locally. I work in Munich, and theater is something else in Munich. It's just a different concept than in Berlin. And that is something I think one has to keep in mind. And therefore, I think one has to have this local funding, which doesn't mean that we need global connections for the theater arts that are very important because of this strong locality, I would argue, which I think is more a local thing. And the other thing I would argue why, because theater has so little funding compared to Netflix, that of course the quality of production cannot always be as high. That means I think there's not so much good theater out there usually, which is also very difficult because the funding is so little. That means you need a different motivation to go to theater just to see the best performances. So one goes to theater, I think, a lot because one goes to the theater, the social aspect of theater. And I don't mean the liveness, but just going out, going for beer. I mean, that's what one noticed during the pandemic, just to be in that space, which I think also is the same as cinema. I wouldn't say it's different. I go to the cinema to have these spaces. These social local spaces are very important for this art form. And I think that's why the local is needed. Otherwise, one has the global thing, one has that with the opera, the highbrow opera productions that are which are streamed all over cinemas in Europe from the Met. But that is a different idea of theater then. I think one sees what happens when theater goes really global. It loses a lot of specificity. And I think much of what is amazing about the art form of theater is this very local specificity.
We have a couple of questions.
Hi, I would somehow like to add to this a very unrefined thought, but this question of local and global was discussed yesterday also already quite a lot. Let's one more thing beforehand. Sorry, like when you're talking about hybrid theater tonight, it seems very much about. It's something I think Christian said. It can be watched in the space and it can be watched online. When I think of hybrid theater, I think of a show that somehow combines both elements. But I don't want to go deeply into that because I think we kind of all agree that it's so hybrid that it's also hard to make the differentiation here. But when we think about this local and global, yesterday I often, I had this thought, it was so much about, so many people could suddenly see my show. I mean, and the numbers were amazing. It was like, whatever, some thoughts in England had been seen by 12,000 people or so. And they watched it in India and they watched it here. And there were so many and they were in their houses watching this. And I was a little bit like, isn't that what we used to call television? It's so many people can see this one thing we've made all over the world in their house. And so I'm wondering, maybe what is being changed is not so much theater, but maybe our way of watching television, but in like a pure sense of television, yeah, seeing something. And Christian, I mean, I can't be as polemic as I maybe could have been because you just gave a good difference about normal, let's say, film theater makers can improvise and all that, but still, maybe that's the best what we can hope from or expect from this, that the way of communication is changed rather than the theater is changed. Because I think, yes, theater is local.
Just one thing, Christiane, it is, if you call it television, then it's a call-in show. Because the advanced, like the show, Gobsquad, I tend to say showcase a bit more, the Gobsquad production had call-in moments. So you really could participate in the production. So it's a bit more than traditional linear television.
Not theater has expanded, but so not theater has expanded, but television has expanded. Mm-hmm. Magda, if you want to contribute, maybe it's very, because we can't hear you when we use the microphone. So if you want to say something, maybe raise your hand. Then, I mean, I will, just if you have like an urgent comment you would like to say, but of course, this is your time now, if you want to speak and answer to that. If
well,
not,
it's kind of an interesting, I have to wait for the, okay. It's a kind of an interesting, very interesting comment, yeah, because when we think about, how television changed to like online streaming. Like used to be like you had to watch your TV show at the particular day in particular time, or you missed it, yeah, or then you were able to record it, and now you basically can watch anything, anytime, any place you want, and it's completely customized to your own, lifestyle, individual lifestyle. So in some ways, streaming theater at a particular time, in order to have an audience participation, it's kind of bringing us back to that moment where things were set in time. And also, like it used to be that, television shows would mark your week. Yeah. I mean, like Thursday, this was this show, Friday was, this show, and the entire day would be like, I remember when, when I was 8 o'clock was a children cartoon in Poland when I was a kid. And this was, the end of the day. Yeah. Like you waited for the cartoon and all of those things. So those things which streamed in particular time used to be like important for the marking of time. Yeah, I mean, when the martial state broke down in Poland in the 1980s, like all of the kids could not watch their morning cartoons. And this is like became kind of a, important traumatic event for my generation. We could not watch morning cartoons on Sunday because there was tanks or Russian tanks on our streets. Yeah. So, so they used to mark the time, those kind of, TV's programming. And now we don't have that. Your time is your own and you do with whatever you want. And so the time has a different, maybe we have a little bit different perception of time. And is theater in some ways by being fixed in time and potentially being fixed in space. And for us, whether we participate online or in person, have to be in a particular place, whether it's digital or real, in a particular time, in order to interact with other people in that moment, there's no synchronized moment, whether that's in some ways is necessary to help us fix ourselves in space and time, and in some ways in a discourse, because the bubbles that we have, all around us that we create through the, the news feeds, which feed us things which confirm our, our biases, kind of like floating in time and space and in the soup of ideas, and whether theater can potentially be the tool which fixes us again, which kind of binds us to time and space, and it binds us to a shared vocabulary and shared discourse. And I do agree with both Christian and Otto that theater should be local. Yeah, I mean this is sort of both local and global at the same time, because it has a purpose in engaging local audiences and the specificity of the language which the local audiences and local art forms have. But also, it's incredibly important for us to engage with the global discourse. And, we see what happens. Yeah, the war in Ukraine, it's going to affect the famine in Africa and prices of wheat and corn all over the place. And, people, like we hear, like I'm from Poland, I have my own, baggage, that historical baggage, and I'm living in the US and you're there in Germany. And, there is a war raging right next to you, and my family is close by there. And so, we have these conversations online with other people from different countries who come with different perspectives. And can we potentially create a theater which is global in that way, on the level of ideas, not necessarily on the level of art forms or kind of a specific, culturally specific specificities. So I think this is what Christian meant when he was, I'm not trying to put the word in your mouth, but this is, the sort of the globality and the global approach, the local approach to theater is what we can potentially bring in to help manage the discourse and to help understand the discourse and to trying to figure out how interconnected we are and how events across the globe affect us. And that's really difficult to avoid. Thank you.
There's one question, but you wanted to answer to the previous question as well, or can we know? Okay, Florian, you have a mic. Okay, Florian, please.
Oh, okay. So I hope this is not going to come across as narcissistic, but this is the third day, and unfortunately we're reaching sort of the end of these 3 super interesting days. And 3 days ago, I tried to sort of anticipate a little bit what might be expecting us, and I anticipated sort of 3 sorts of questions or insights, just as an audience member of this conference, or was hoping for 3 sorts of questions to be addressed, and I really think they were addressed. And the last one of those, I'd just be interested to perhaps, because in this particular panel, it wasn't as present perhaps as the other 2. So I was wondering whether you could comment on that third one. So the first one we heard a lot about in this panel was more or less about the medium. It's the older question of what digitality and hybridity do to theaters, and what theaters have done in this particular time since the pandemic. The second question was more pointedly about the pandemic and that acceleration in figuring out those first questions. And it was the institutional question, right? And the way that I thought about it was about which kinds of barriers and which kinds of freedoms have come up from an institutional perspective for so-called free artists and for different kinds of theatrical institutions. And I think you've said a lot about that also in this panel. And the last one was more about, I guess, even more pointedly about the sort of double sense of viral in the title of the conference, and even more broadly about just the political and social and global moment that we're in. And that's what I'm asking you about. And basically the question was, well, if we're seeing this double sense of viral here, the technological one, and then of course the pandemic one, are there things that you see in those, and maybe it's too early to say, but in those practices that you've seen emerge in those 2 years, are there any aspects where you think, well, actually this does in some way help or throw light upon big social questions? And my example was the question of the sort of social technological virus of conspiracy thinking and all of that kind of stuff that we've seen in the last 2 years about the pandemic, where the change in the medium, in the practice of theater or whatever art forms are now emerging, might, help us sort of understand that or experience that in particular ways. Was that sort of clear? Whether you in your experience or over the last 3 days thought, oh, here there's really where those things are starting to sort of come together in this particular moment.
Yesterday, Ingo Savilla had this line, if digitalization is the answer, what is the question? And I think most of the productions in the last 2 years had a quite simple, straightforward question. The question was, how do we feel in lockdown? I mean, most of the productions speak about that, content-wise. And now we have to find a new question. And I think the question of the global village will be one of the fruitful questions we should come up with. And a second thing, I think what we've learned in the discourse and also in the practice of online theater was liveness and interaction is essential. Otherwise, it doesn't feel like theater. And also at Nachtkritik, we notice, of course, the consumer logic is we want to have things on demand. It's nice to have things 24 hours or 48 hours and have time to watch whenever, shortly before midnight, whenever I feel like it. But I think if you have it on demand, it kind of tends towards, it is rather an informative, a kind of information thing. It is not so much a kind of aesthetic experience. Whereas if you have it live and if you have it scarce and if you have it, okay, what your once in a lifetime thing, 12 hours with Gob Squad, then it becomes kind of precious and it becomes a totally different experience. And also because you're invited to participate. Yes. And the moment when I call in, or I just send in text message, but they read out my text message. And it was, I was shocked. It was my line in a production of Gob Squad. Yeah, it was actually the line of my daughter. But yes, but we sat there and we said, wow, yeah, it is our words. And that made it precious, of course, and that made it theatrical. And I also think there are other media that have theatrical aspects, just to mention that. I think Lars von Trier films, like Dogville, as a kind of theatrical film. But we should reflect on why is it worthwhile going online as a theater maker. And I think, yeah, you've heard my statement. I think it's worthwhile.
Can I add to that? Because I have again the contrary opinion. I would say, like I said, I don't think this essential discussion. I wouldn't agree with it. I wouldn't say there's a general essential difference between theater and installation art. Everything is very fluid today. There is a difference in the competences the practitioners bring with them. That I think is a difference. It's a different education, different sensibilities. They are very valuable. And I would think what we see, what can make a difference. I don't think theater will go viral in the sense that a tweet can go viral. It is niche and elite, that was said today. And I think it is that, and it won't. Otherwise, it will become television, and then it has to compete with Netflix. And that chances, it's hard to compete against Netflix once you're in there, once you're in the streaming market. So I think that's okay. I think only because it's niche doesn't mean it is not important. The opposite is the case. And I think that is what, theater doesn't have to be mass medium to be important. And I think the importance is in the articulation of certain realities. It's some kind of a social thinking that is going on in theater to articulate a certain reality. For example, like that was before the pandemic, but Anta Recke's production of Mittelreich in the Munich Kammerspiele articulated the structural racism in German theater institutions. And she made that, she was not showing something that we knew before. She was creating a reality, making this reality not only visible in the sense that one could have known it, but it was aesthetically performed, came on the stage. And I think that is the chance of theater arts. And I think what the good thing is the competences, the digital competences that go into theater, because that makes theater makers able to address certain realities that are very there. Making the example Gob Squad, the introduction of the video cameras into the theater stage, I don't think was more because it created a completely different way to look at theater for the audience, but because it could get certain realities on stage, could get popular reality, popular media on stage, and I think what we experienced in the pandemic, this strong digitality, drive to digitality, puts these techniques and technologies into the hand of theater artists. And I would say that is the chance that theater can better address certain contemporary, very important issues, which before were only could be put into some conflict drama, which might not be adequate to find our digital reality.
Magda, would you like to answer to this question as well?
I'm like a synthesis, right? We have a Hegelian thing going on here. Can you hear me? So, well, I mean, it's been already touched upon in multiple ways. Like what theater can do differently and all of this. I mean, the fluidity of disciplines that we see right now, and this kind of attempt to define what particular art is. Is it still art or is it code? Is it a museum piece or is it performance piece? All of those things. I mean, it's a kind of like endless conversation. Like we do have those disciplines which have a particular lineages and traditions and canons, but we also have works which are very fluid and which move across various disciplines. So the thought that we can kind of explore this boundaries or lack of boundaries between different art forms, between different entertainment forms, I think it's exciting, and it does reflect the way that we structured our lives right now, that we are structured by our digital lives right now. Yeah, I mean, there is a whole area of techno self-studies which is trying to figure out how our psyche have changed because of the digital revolution. In the same way that we've been trying to figure out how the invention of the press, brought forth the Renaissance and Enlightenment, and how the encyclopedia brought in, import of coffee changed the coffee culture and the intellectual culture of Paris and Germany, and was able to bring forth the ideas of the Enlightenment and the ideas of human rights and all of this, when people were sitting together, late at night, not sleeping and talking. Yeah. And so we are in this particular moment where this new revolution is happening, and it's difficult for I'm like the liminal generation, yeah, in between the two cultures, the digital culture and then the analog culture, as we're trying to kind of figure out how this is going to change the way that we communicate. Is this going to fundamentally change our psychology, our human psychology, or how we're going to adapt to this new world? How we're going to define ourselves? I mean, we know there is the research showing the increase, the increase of narcissism among teenagers who are so focused on self-presentation in the digital sphere. And how will this impact the social bonds, or how will this impact our problem solving of social issues that require much broader participation beyond the self-presentation? Yeah. And so theater should be at the forefront of thinking through that. And we have, the skills and the tools and the history of being able to do that. Theater was always, a kind of visual reiteration of philosophy. And so the philosophy of today is changing, and we need to be able to reflect the way that life is also changing, and that our ways of conceptualizing ourselves and our relations and, our politics and is all based on what's going on in the digital sphere to a large degree. And so, we need to be able to engage with that. And that's just the way it is. Yeah, I mean, the invention of the electricity changed the way that theater shows were being staged. Now you can do them in the evening. You don't need, the fire to light the stage. And so the same way, we will adapt to this and maybe create a new art form, or perhaps create some form of theater that is different, or that is more hybrid in together with other genres. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Magda. Thank you, everyone. And this ties it back to the end of the last panel as well, where we asked about, why digitality in theater, and so it is. It's the form that we use to make art, or in order to address certain issues that we are, or the world that we are connected in, we need new forms, and therefore theater will change. And whether we call it theater or not, we'll see. But thank you very much, everyone, for participating, especially for thank you very much, the three of you, for your very provocative and very contrary impulses that have provoked a very stimulating conversation, which I hope we can continue outside. There are some drinks. The exhibition, I think, is still partially open, hopefully. Great. So please have a look for those who haven't. Thank you very much, and see you out there for a drink. Thanks again. Thank you, Magda.